Marcus Thompson, the police chief of a quiet suburban town, had finally been granted a rare Saturday off. The peaceful respite from his usual duties was exactly what he needed. After a long week of handling the usual police calls, managing his department, and putting out proverbial fires, he was looking forward to enjoying a couple of hours of calm. Sitting on the patio of his well-kept home, Marcus had made it a point to relax and disconnect for a while. He had a cup of coffee in hand and was dressed casually in gray sweatpants and a hoodie, unlike the typical sharp uniform he wore at work. This Saturday, he was determined to give himself a much-needed break, free from the stress of his job and the constant demands of the community. But what started as a peaceful moment quickly turned into an unexpected series of events. As Marcus relaxed in his chair, he found himself distracted by the irregularities on his home Wi-Fi network. For a while, he had noticed unusual activity, devices connecting to his network that he hadn't authorized. While Marcus was no stranger to technology, he knew the importance of keeping his system secure, both for his own peace of mind and because of his position. So, on this rare break, he decided to take action. What do you think? Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, like, share, and don't forget to subscribe for more shocking stories like this. He leaned forward and started fiddling with his phone, intending to update the Wi-Fi password. His goal was simple: make sure his network was secure again and remove any unauthorized devices that had gained access. It was a quick and easy fix, something anyone with a bit of tech knowledge could do. In his relaxed state, he didn't anticipate the trouble that would follow. As Marcus worked on updating the password, he was completely unaware of the pair of eyes observing him from the window across the street. Karen Miller, a neighbor who had lived in the area for years, was watching him suspiciously. She had always kept to herself, but recently, she had been more aware of the changes happening in the neighborhood. The sight of Marcus, casually dressed and focused on his phone, was a curious one for her. She didn't know much about him other than that he was the local police chief, a figure she never really interacted with. Karen wasn't used to seeing people on her block take such a laid-back approach to life. The neighborhood had always been orderly, the homes neatly manicured, and the people well-to-do. Seeing Marcus, dressed in simple sweatpants and a hoodie, messing with what looked like a complicated technological device raised suspicions in her mind. There was something unsettling about it, though she couldn't put her finger on why. Her mind began to race as she watched him from her window. She had heard about crime in the area, and even though things had always seemed peaceful, Karen had recently grown wary of any changes. The sight of Marcus working on his Wi-Fi felt out of place to her, and her imagination quickly began to run wild. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just that Marcus was sitting outside on a Saturday, everything about the way he was fiddling with his technology seemed odd. And in her mind, this small, seemingly harmless action evolved into something much more suspicious. What if he was doing something illegal? What if he was involved in activities that could harm the neighborhood or her property? In her mind, Karen began to spin a narrative. She imagined Marcus using his position to conduct secret activities, perhaps hacking into local networks or doing something shady under the guise of his police role. She wasn't sure why she thought this, but the fear that something was wrong grew stronger. The more she thought about it, the more her suspicion solidified. She told herself that he was probably up to something he shouldn't be, and she started to feel the need to take action. This wasn't just a simple case of someone fixing their internet connection, no, this felt like a covert operation unfolding in broad daylight. And it was happening right across the street from her. Karen's suspicions were now in full force, and there was no turning back for her. She decided she needed to do something, even though she wasn't sure exactly what that would be. Karen had always prided herself on being a vigilant member of the community, keeping an eye on things around her, making sure the neighborhood remained safe and well-maintained. She didn't usually concern herself with the details of other people's lives, but there was something about Marcus's presence on the block that didn't sit well with her. As the days passed, Karen found herself becoming increasingly obsessed with the image of Marcus sitting on his patio, working on his Wi-Fi network. Her suspicions continued to fester, growing more intense each time she saw him outside. Every time she peeked through her blinds or caught a glimpse of him from her window, her anxiety increased. What was he doing? Why was he out there, making changes to his network when no one else seemed to be? At first, Karen had tried to brush it off, assuming that maybe she was just overreacting. But as time passed, she found it harder to let go of her unease. The sight of Marcus sitting on his patio, so relaxed, almost seemed too casual. She couldn't shake the thought that he was hiding something. And each time she saw him out there, she became more convinced that his actions were more than just innocent home improvement or a tech project. Her curiosity morphed into suspicion, and suspicion into fear. She couldn't help but imagine the worst-case scenarios. What if he was using the Wi-Fi network for illegal activity? What if he was conducting surveillance or trying to infiltrate people's personal information? She had heard of similar cases in the news, stories about individuals using their position or access to hack into private systems for nefarious purposes. And even though Marcus was the police chief, she couldn't help but question whether he could be abusing his position for personal gain. The more she thought about it, the more she became convinced that Marcus was hiding something sinister. She convinced herself that the technology he was using was not just for home improvement. Perhaps he was using it to do something underhanded, and the Wi-Fi password update was merely a cover for his true intentions. The thought of Marcus being involved in illegal activities made her uneasy and scared for the safety of her neighborhood. Her mind spiraled further. Was he really working on his home security system, as he had explained before, or was there something else going on? She even began to feel paranoid when other neighbors passed by. They didn't seem to notice what was happening in the same way she did. Karen wondered if everyone else was simply blind to the potential danger. Why didn't they see what she saw? That's when she decided that she couldn't just ignore it any longer. Her suspicions were too strong to dismiss, and she had to act before it was too late. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she punched in the number for the police. If Marcus was involved in anything illegal, she needed to alert the authorities. Her sense of duty as a concerned neighbor had overpowered her initial hesitation, and she dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator answered. I think I have a suspicious person living across from me, Karen said, her voice shaky but determined. There's a man named Marcus, and I believe he's tampering with the internet services in the neighborhood. He's been working on some tech in his house, and I'm concerned that he might be involved in illegal activity. The operator listened patiently, asking for further details. Karen continued to explain everything she had observed, repeating her suspicion that Marcus was up to something dangerous. In her mind, she had connected the dots and was sure that something criminal was taking place. The fact that Marcus was a police chief only added to her concern. She felt certain that her call was justified, and she hoped the authorities would take her seriously. The call ended, and Karen, now relieved that she had taken action, waited for the police to arrive. She was confident that the authorities would investigate and put an end to whatever Marcus was doing. As she waited for the sirens to approach, she felt a strange sense of vindication, thinking that she had done the right thing. Little did she know, the moment of truth was about to unfold, and her suspicions, which had grown so intense, would be tested in ways she never imagined. The sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, gradually growing louder as the police cars drew closer to Marcus's house. His quiet Saturday, one he had hoped would be free of interruption, was about to be disrupted in a way he never anticipated. He had been inside his home for a while, sitting back and relaxing after a busy week, but now his phone buzzed with a sudden alert that his Wi-Fi system had detected unusual activity. He hadn't expected to deal with anything more than the minor update he had begun earlier. However, before he could get back to his phone, there was a knock at the door. His heart skipped a beat as he saw two police officers standing at the front door. He had no idea what was going on. Had someone reported a disturbance? Was this related to the Wi-Fi issues he had been working on? Good afternoon, Chief Thompson, Officer Reynolds said, a friendly tone in his voice as he introduced himself and his partner, Officer Carter. We've received a call from your neighbor, Karen Whitman, reporting some suspicious activity. We just need to ask you a few questions. Marcus's mind raced for a moment. Suspicious activity? Was this about the Wi-Fi update? He'd been expecting this confrontation in a way, but hearing it from the police still caught him off guard. Sure, come on in, Marcus replied, leading them inside. He quickly explained the situation, detailing how he was merely updating his Wi-Fi password and installing a security system for his own home. However, as he spoke, he could see the confusion on the officers' faces. Clearly, they were expecting something more. Your neighbor, Ms. Whitman, seemed pretty convinced that you were tampering with internet services in the neighborhood, Officer Reynolds said, looking at Marcus with a quizzical expression. She's mistaken, Marcus explained, trying to remain patient. I was just updating my own Wi-Fi. There's nothing suspicious here. Officer Carter nodded. We'll need to check with her to verify the details. But it's pretty clear that there's been a misunderstanding. As the officers spoke with Karen, Marcus couldn't help but feel a mix of frustration and disbelief. How had this escalated so quickly? Why was Karen so quick to judge him based on his presence in the neighborhood? It was clear to him that the issue wasn't his Wi-Fi, it was something deeper. The suspicion, the assumptions about who he was, it all felt too familiar. But as the conversation unfolded, it soon became clear as the police officers approached, Marcus Thompson remained calm but inwardly perplexed. He couldn't understand how things had escalated so quickly, from a simple Wi-Fi update to an entire police intervention. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. All he had wanted was to enjoy a peaceful Saturday afternoon, working on his home network, and yet now, he was dealing with a full-blown confrontation with the police, all because of his neighbor's unfounded suspicions. He stood by the front door as Officers Reynolds and Carter entered his house, calmly listening to their questions. Marcus explained once more that he had merely been updating his Wi-Fi password and wasn't involved in any illegal activities. It wasn't the first time he had handled a misunderstanding, but the idea that his neighbor, Delilah Finch, had somehow spun this into something criminal was baffling. After a few minutes, Officer Reynolds, the more senior officer, glanced at Marcus, signaling for him to wait as he stepped outside to speak with Delilah. Marcus took a moment to gather his thoughts, pacing slowly around his living room. What had driven Delilah to make such a call? Was it his presence in the neighborhood? His position as the police chief? He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper at play. A few moments later, Officer Reynolds and Officer Carter returned to the door. Behind them stood Delilah, her face flushed with anger. She had been standing outside the entire time, her posture tense and her hands crossed. Her eyes shot daggers at Marcus, but as she stepped inside, she was forced to face him once again. This is the man who's been tampering with our internet. Delilah spat, pointing directly at Marcus. You see him, don't you? He's been hacking into people's networks. I know it. I've seen him messing with wires and gadgets. He's not just some regular guy, he's a threat to the whole neighborhood. Marcus was taken aback by her vehemence. Delilah, I'm not sure where you're getting this, but I'm not involved in anything illegal, he said calmly, trying to defuse the situation. He glanced at the officers, hoping they would take control. I've been updating my Wi-Fi password. That's all. Officer Reynolds, who had remained quiet up until now, addressed Delilah firmly. Ma'am, we've spoken with Mr. Thompson, and there's no evidence of any wrongdoing. He's simply updating his Wi-Fi, as he's explained several times. You've accused him of hacking into internet services, but there's no basis for that. Delilah's face twisted with frustration. You're not listening, she shouted, her voice rising. Do you think I'm making this up? I've lived in this neighborhood for years, and now I'm supposed to believe that a man like him can just come in and do whatever he wants. You're all blind to it. He's a menace. Officer Carter stepped forward. Delilah, we've explained that there's no reason for your accusations. If you don't calm down, we'll have to take further action. Delilah's eyes flickered with panic, but she wasn't ready to back down. "You're making a mistake. He doesn't belong here, and I'm not going to stand by while he wrecks this neighborhood," she shouted. Without warning, Delilah's hand shot out toward the nearest object, a heavy stone that had been sitting in the flower bed just outside the door. She picked it up and hurled it with surprising force toward Marcus's smart lock, which was still attached to the pool gate. The rock struck the device with a loud crack, sending a shard of plastic flying across the yard. The lock, which had been carefully installed just days earlier, was now shattered. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, the shock of what had just happened sinking in. His property had been damaged, and it was clear that Delilah's anger had taken an ugly turn. He wasn't sure whether to be angry or to feel pity for someone so consumed by their own fears. Officer Reynolds immediately stepped forward, his voice commanding. "Delilah, that's it. You're under arrest for destruction of property and assault on an officer," he said, his tone cold. Delilah's eyes widened as she realized the gravity of her actions. "You need to calm down and come with us," he added. Delilah's resistance melted away as the reality of the situation hit her. She had just crossed a line, and there was no going back. She muttered something under her breath, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger as Officer Reynolds placed her hands behind her back. She was led away by the officers, her protests growing fainter as they moved down the driveway. Marcus stood there, still processing the scene, watching as Delilah was escorted to the squad car. The damage to his smart lock was severe, but the emotional toll it had taken on him was even greater. He had always worked hard to foster a sense of peace and cooperation in the community, but it was clear that some people, like Delilah, could never see beyond their own biases. As he stood in the doorway, watching the police car drive away with Delilah inside, Marcus took a deep breath. The situation had left him shaken, but it also reinforced something he already knew: no one should ever have to deal with such unwarranted hostility, especially when their only intention was to improve their own lives. After Delilah was taken away, the neighborhood was left in an uneasy silence. Marcus stood outside his home, looking at the mess she had left behind. The shattered smart lock was a symbol of something much larger than a mere act of vandalism. It represented the deep-seated prejudice and misunderstanding that still existed, even in a seemingly peaceful town. Delilah had allowed her suspicions to cloud her judgment, and now she had paid the price. A few minutes later, Officer Reynolds returned to Marcus's front porch. "I'm sorry about all of this, Chief Thompson," he said, his tone apologetic. "I know this was a huge inconvenience for you." Marcus nodded, still taking in everything that had transpired. "It's not just the inconvenience, officer. It's the fact that I had to deal with this. This whole situation, it wasn't about the Wi-Fi. It was about someone making assumptions based on who I am." Officer Reynolds sighed. "You're right. We've had similar complaints before, and it's always the same. People act on fear, and that fear leads to misunderstandings. I know this was difficult for you." Marcus shook his head. "It's not just difficult. It's damaging. To me, to the neighborhood, to everyone who's ever faced this kind of treatment. People like Delilah, they don't see the whole picture. They don't realize how harmful their assumptions can be." "I'll make sure this report is marked as a false one," Officer Reynolds assured him. "And we'll be taking this up with Delilah. Her call was not only baseless but also a waste of police resources. We've got enough on our plates without having to deal with these kinds of misunderstandings." The apology from Officer Reynolds did little to ease the frustration Marcus felt, but he appreciated the recognition of the seriousness of the situation. As the officers left, Marcus stood on his porch, feeling the weight of the day's events. He wasn't sure how things would change from here, but one thing was clear: there was still much work to be done. Delilah, meanwhile, was left to face the consequences of her actions. Her behavior had been reckless, and the embarrassment she would feel when this story spread through the neighborhood would be a lasting one. Marcus knew that she wouldn't be the only one to learn from this incident. It had exposed a flaw in how people like her saw others, and hopefully, it would serve as a wake-up call to challenge those assumptions. But for now, Marcus turned back toward his house, feeling a quiet sense of resolution. Delilah's actions had brought unnecessary trouble into his life, but they had also presented an opportunity to continue fighting for fairness, understanding, and a kind of community that embraced everyone, no matter their background. As the sun began to set, Marcus returned inside, determined to move forward with the strength of someone who had just survived a storm. The next few days after Delilah's arrest were filled with a mixture of public fallout and introspection for both Marcus and Delilah. The police chief, having spent years cultivating a reputation of calm professionalism, now found himself thrust into a highly public situation. His neighbor, who had accused him of criminal activity, had to contend with the ramifications of her actions. As the story spread through the neighborhood, there were two distinct sides. Many of the residents rallied around Marcus, offering words of support and respect. They saw what had transpired as not just a simple misunderstanding but as a stark reminder of the deep-seated biases that still lingered beneath the surface of their seemingly peaceful town. The hashtag Justice for Marcus began circulating online, with messages of solidarity flooding social media. On the other hand, Delilah's reputation in the community had taken a massive hit. She had lived in the neighborhood for years, maintaining a pristine image as a reliable and upstanding citizen. But now, her name was associated with accusations of racial profiling and unwarranted police calls. The shame she felt was palpable, and it was only a matter of time before the social and professional consequences of her actions began to affect her. At first, Delilah didn't realize the full extent of the damage she had caused. She still clung to the belief that she had been justified in her actions, despite the clear evidence to the contrary. But as her friends and family members distanced themselves from her, and as the neighborhood began to turn their backs, the realization hit her hard. One evening, as Delilah sat alone in her living room, the weight of her decisions finally settled in. She had lost more than just a neighbor's trust, she had lost her place in the community. The job she had worked for years to build now seemed precarious. After the police left Marcus Thompson's house, the incident quickly became the talk of the neighborhood. What began as a simple misunderstanding, sparked by Delilah Finch's baseless suspicions, had morphed into a scandal that sent ripples throughout the town. As news of Delilah's actions spread, it didn't take long for the public to react, loudly and passionately. Marcus, for his part, had been shaken by the events but remained resolute. He had spent years in law enforcement, dealing with the complexities of human nature, including the deep-rooted biases that could fuel irrational actions. But even he hadn't expected this, a neighbor accusing him of a crime he hadn't committed, all because of her assumptions about him. Despite the shock, Marcus quickly became a symbol of resilience. The media caught wind of the story, and soon, news outlets were running segments about the racial tensions that had boiled over into this very public confrontation. Articles began to pop up in the local newspaper, each one more critical of Delilah's actions. People in the neighborhood began to post messages of support for Marcus on social media, using hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #EndRacialBias. Many expressed how disappointed they were that someone they had considered an upstanding neighbor could be responsible for such a deeply flawed and destructive judgment. At the same time, Delilah's life began to unravel. The backlash she faced was immediate and intense. Her friends, colleagues, and even acquaintances distanced themselves from her, unable to support the actions that had brought such public shame. The accusations she had made against Marcus not only tarnished her reputation but also highlighted the ugly biases that she, like so many others, had buried beneath the surface. For Delilah, the public reaction was more than she could handle. As the days passed, her social media accounts became flooded with messages of outrage. Some were calling for an apology, others for a public reckoning. The damage was irreparable, and she realized, too late, that she had become the villain in her own neighborhood story. She had assumed the worst about Marcus simply because of the color of his skin, and now, the whole town knew what she had done. In the quiet moments at home, Delilah found herself questioning her actions. How had she allowed her fear and suspicion to get the best of her? The things Marcus had said about her assumptions stung, but they were undeniable truths. He had explained calmly and repeatedly that he wasn't doing anything wrong, that his actions had nothing to do with her internet troubles. But Delilah had been too wrapped up in her own perception of the world to listen. Instead of extending a hand in curiosity, she had built a wall of judgment, and now, that wall was crashing down around her. Her professional life, too, was beginning to suffer. The small business she ran, which had been thriving, now found its customers increasingly hesitant to engage. Word about her actions had spread beyond the neighborhood, and many of her clients pulled their support, unwilling to associate with someone who had publicly shown such prejudice. The financial hit she took was significant, but the emotional toll was worse. Every morning she woke up to news stories about the incident, her face plastered across the screen as a symbol of intolerance. No amount of apology or regret could undo what had been done. But it wasn't just her professional life that was crumbling. Delilah's personal relationships also took a hit. Friends and family, who had once stood by her, now avoided her or outright criticized her. Some were silent, unsure of how to react, while others let her know exactly how they felt. Her closest friends, once the pillars of her support system, had become distant, unable to forgive what she had done. They had witnessed her anger, her refusal to listen to Marcus, and her inability to see beyond her own biases. Delilah began to feel a deep sense of isolation. The neighborhood that she had once considered her safe haven now felt foreign to her. She could no longer walk down the street without feeling eyes on her, judging her, whispering behind her back. The judgment she had so freely cast upon Marcus was now turned inward, and she was forced to confront her own prejudices head-on. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to rebuild the damage Delilah had caused to his home. The shattered smart lock was replaced, and his Wi-Fi system was restored. He had learned that while the material damage was frustrating, it was the emotional toll that had hit him the hardest. Being accused of something so baseless, being seen as a criminal because of assumptions, was an experience he would never forget. But he wasn't about to let Delilah's actions define his experience in the neighborhood. Instead, he used the attention to speak out about the issues that had been brought to light. He knew that this incident could serve as a teachable moment for the entire community, a way to spark meaningful dialogue about race and assumptions. In his interviews with the media, Marcus was calm and measured, refusing to let anger or bitterness cloud his message. He explained that while the incident was painful, it was not unique. He shared his experiences as a black man in law enforcement, detailing the struggles he faced every day to overcome bias and judgment. He emphasized the importance of listening to people before jumping to conclusions, of making space for others' perspectives, and of examining one's own biases. He knew that Delilah's actions, while harmful, were rooted in fear, ignorance, and a lack of understanding. The media coverage of the incident continued to spread, and Marcus became a prominent voice in the conversation about racial profiling and biases in everyday life. He worked with local organizations to organize community events focused on education and understanding, using the incident as a springboard to talk about larger societal issues. As for Delilah, she continued to retreat into her home, increasingly isolated from the community she had once known. She had lost her place in the world she had once occupied, and now she had to live with the knowledge that she had not only wronged an innocent man but also become a cautionary tale. She couldn't undo what had been done, but she was determined to try and make amends, even if that meant doing the hard work of confronting her own biases. Part 8, Delilah's Isolation and Marcus' Advocacy. Delilah's life had become a daily reminder of the damage she had caused. She had been the one to call the police, the one who had made the baseless accusation, and now she was the one who had to face the consequences. The once vibrant neighborhood she had known for so many years had turned its back on her, and there was no escape from the consequences of her actions. She had hoped that time would heal the wounds, but the reality was far more complicated. Each day was filled with shame, regret, and a growing sense of alienation. Her business had suffered, her social circle had dwindled, and the respect she once commanded had been replaced by derision and suspicion. Delilah had hoped that she could weather the storm, that the backlash would eventually subside. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that this was not a temporary setback. Her reputation had been irreparably damaged, and her once stable life had fallen apart. Even the few friends she had left struggled to offer support, and Delilah found herself alone, trapped by the consequences of her own actions. She tried to reach out to Marcus, to apologize for what she had done, but the barriers between them were too high. She knew that words couldn't undo the harm she had caused. She had to live with the knowledge that her actions had permanently changed the dynamic of their relationship, and the entire neighborhood. There was no simple way to erase the damage done by her assumptions and her refusal to listen. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to rise above the situation. The public support he had received in the aftermath of the incident had given him a platform to speak out about the systemic issues that plagued his community. He had used the opportunity to launch initiatives aimed at fostering understanding and dismantling the biases that still lingered in his town. He worked with local organizations to develop diversity training programs, and he spoke at community events, encouraging people to listen to each other and to challenge their assumptions. Through it all, Marcus had remained focused on the bigger picture. He knew that change wouldn't come easily, but he was determined to make a difference. While Delilah had retreated into shame, Marcus had found a renewed sense of purpose. He had learned that the fight for fairness and justice was ongoing, and that even small victories could spark change. He was committed to seeing that his community became a place where people could live without fear of being judged or unfairly targeted because of who they were. In the end, Delilah's story became one of caution, a reminder that assumptions and prejudices could lead to devastating consequences. And for Marcus, it became a story of resilience, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, one could find a way to rise above and make a difference. While the road to healing was long, Marcus knew that the work was worth it, because the fight for a fair and just community was a battle that would never truly end. The dust had barely settled after the incident with Delilah Finch, but the impact of her actions rippled through the neighborhood like a stone thrown into a still pond. While Delilah struggled to regain some semblance of normalcy in her life, Marcus Thompson found himself thrust into a position of prominence. He had not only been wronged but had become a symbol of dignity in the face of unwarranted aggression. It was a role he hadn't expected but one he had accepted with quiet resolve. Despite the public support he received, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper had been exposed about his community, something that went beyond a single incident of racial profiling. He knew that Delilah's accusations were just a reflection of broader issues, fear of the unknown, biases that many had not even recognized in themselves, and a tendency to view people through a lens of stereotypes. Delilah had targeted him, but she was only a product of a much larger problem that ran through the fabric of the community. As the story of the altercation between Marcus and Delilah continued to be discussed in the local media, Marcus used his newfound platform to advocate for change. He didn't want to be just a victim of this situation, he wanted to turn it into a teachable moment. He joined forces with local groups, launching initiatives to promote diversity and inclusion, aiming to educate people about biases and the impact of stereotypes. Delilah, on the other hand, was experiencing the full weight of the consequences of her actions. Once a well-regarded member of the community, she was now ostracized. Her business, which had once been thriving, was now struggling, as clients chose to distance themselves from her. Delilah had received numerous calls from friends and family, expressing their disappointment and regret at her behavior. The more she tried to explain her actions, the more she found herself isolated, with no one willing to stand by her. The embarrassment was suffocating. She had once prided herself on being a strong, opinionated person, but now she realized how fragile her world had been. The respect she had once commanded was gone, replaced by the judgment of others. Delilah had always been a part of the community's fabric, but now she felt like an outsider. The police report had gone public, and the story had spread beyond the town. News outlets picked up on the incident, making her the face of prejudice in her community. She had become the cautionary tale, the example of how fear and prejudice could spiral into a public spectacle. One evening, Delilah found herself in front of the mirror, reflecting on the person she had become. She was no longer sure who she was or how she had gotten here. The anger she had once felt toward Marcus seemed distant now, and the weight of her choices pressed down on her like a heavy stone. She had thought that she was doing the right thing, protecting her neighborhood, but now, she saw the truth. Her actions had been driven by fear, not reason, and her fear had led her to make a judgment that had not only ruined her life but also caused harm to an innocent person. Despite the deep shame she felt, Delilah knew that she couldn't undo what had been done. Her path forward wasn't about erasing the past but about facing it head-on. She had made a mistake, and now it was time to pay the price. But even in the midst of her personal reckoning, she couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this was the wake-up call she needed. She would have to rebuild her life from the ground up, but this time, with humility and a greater awareness of the damage her prejudices had caused. Meanwhile, Marcus was not slowing down. He had already begun working on community programs that aimed to foster better understanding and to help people like Delilah realize their own biases. He understood that one person's actions didn't define an entire community, but he also knew that the change had to start somewhere. Through local meetings, workshops, and online campaigns, he brought people together to have open, honest conversations about race and the impact of stereotypes. As Marcus poured himself into this work, he also started to reflect on the lessons he had learned. The fight for justice wasn't always as straightforward as it seemed. In his work as a police chief, he had seen how easily things could go wrong, how a moment of misunderstanding or prejudice could escalate into something much larger. But he also knew that the power to make a difference lay within each individual. It wasn't enough to just be aware of biases. People had to actively work to change their perceptions and actions. Over the next few weeks, Marcus continued to see the ripple effects of his actions. More people in the community started showing up to the workshops, engaging in conversations about bias and prejudice. Some were hesitant at first, unsure of how to navigate the topic, but as the discussions continued, more people began to speak openly about their own experiences and biases. The community, slowly but surely, began to heal. As Delilah continued to process everything that had happened, she found herself at a crossroads. She had lost so much, but she also realized that she could make amends, even if it was going to take time. She reached out to Marcus, hoping to speak with him face to face. Her request wasn't about clearing her name, it was about owning up to her mistakes and seeking understanding. Marcus agreed to meet with her, but the conversation that followed wasn't an easy one. Delilah admitted that she had acted out of fear and that she had allowed her biases to cloud her judgment. Marcus listened intently, but he didn't offer forgiveness right away. Instead, he spoke about the impact of her actions on him, on the community, and on herself. He made it clear that while healing could begin, it wouldn't be immediate. The road ahead would be long for both of them. Delilah, now deeply humbled, promised to do the work needed to change, not just for her own sake, but for the sake of others who might unknowingly hold similar prejudices. It was a small step, but it was a step toward growth. Part 10, The Road to Healing and Redemption. The journey toward redemption is never linear. For Delilah Finch, the road was filled with setbacks and moments of doubt. She had hurt someone she barely knew, because of her fear and assumptions. But she was committed to the work of becoming a better person, someone who could contribute to a community that valued empathy and understanding over judgment and suspicion. Marcus Thompson, too, knew that the work was far from finished. His advocacy for racial equality had gained significant traction in the community, but there was still much to be done. He was encouraged by the conversations taking place, the progress that was being made, and the willingness of people to confront their biases. But he understood that change, true change, was a long process, and it required ongoing effort from everyone involved. The next few months saw a series of town meetings, diversity workshops, and community-building events that allowed residents to continue the work Marcus had started. Delilah, now a more reflective person, attended many of these events, not as an organizer or leader, but as a participant, learning from others and sharing her own story. Her presence was sometimes met with skepticism, but over time, people saw her commitment to change. For Delilah, the hardest part was confronting the truth of her actions. She had to face the consequences of what she had done, not just in public but in her own heart. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but she was learning. She reached out to Marcus, attending one of his workshops and asking for advice on how to be an ally to others who might still be in the same place she had been. Marcus offered guidance, but he also made it clear that the work of changing oneself didn't come with a guarantee of immediate forgiveness or acceptance. It was a journey, and only through consistent effort could one hope to make a lasting impact. Over time, Delilah's relationship with Marcus improved, though it was always tinged with the understanding that the past couldn't be erased. But they both realized that they had learned something important from the experience. People were capable of growth, and everyone could change if they were willing to put in the work. As the town continued to heal, Marcus and Delilah worked together, advocating for change and building a stronger, more inclusive community. The road to healing wasn't without its bumps, but both Marcus and Delilah had learned that the only way forward was together. In the end, Marcus Thompson's quiet resolve had not only strengthened him but had also sparked a change in the community he served. And for Delilah, her journey toward redemption had begun, and though it was still a long road ahead, she was no longer the person she had once been. She was ready to rebuild, not just her life, but the trust she had broken, step by step. Hey everyone! If you found this story powerful and meaningful, please show your support by hitting the like button, subscribing to the channel, ringing the bell to never miss our thought-provoking content. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that inspire, educate, and challenge perspectives. Thank you for being part of this journey.